From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Barris here on a Thursday, and I hope you're having a good day so far. You're starting it with us, and I appreciate that, and you're always going to be welcome to join in the conversation. We'll get the phone number up there in just a moment. You probably are aware of this here in the state of Tennessee, and I think this may be a law in most states in the country. You are required to report under state law if you suspect a case of child abuse. It's breaking the law if you witness or know of something like that happening and choose, I don't want to get involved, and ignore it, which first of all means you're a dirtbag to begin with, but second of all, it is the law. If you suspect some child being abused, you are to report it. Now, when you report it, you have the option now of remaining anonymous, and there could be some good reasons why you might want to remain anonymous, or you can give them your information and they may get back to you to get more details on what you witnessed down the road. So there's an option there. But now there is a piece of legislation being considered by our state lawmakers which would require those who report child abuse or neglect to disclose their identity. And there are some questions about whether that's best for the overall picture, and really everything that is changed with regard to this issue should all go through the filter of what's best for children. We're going to talk about that and maybe get your opinions on what you think of that, whether or not it's right to require folks reporting cases of child abuse have their identity at least shared with Department of Children's Services moving forward. To talk about this, two folks who are very involved with the issue of protecting children. Dawn Harper, she's the CEO of the Nashville Children's Alliance. It's good to have her with us this morning. And Stephen Warner, Executive Director of the Children's Advocacy Centers of Tennessee. Did I get that right? This legislation lawmakers are looking at would basically require anyone who reports child abuse or neglect then to, at least through DCS, provide their identity. Doesn't mean it's going to go public at that point, but under the law, potentially, once they reveal who they are, if it were to go to court and someone were to, go to a judge could make the call to release that name publicly or to at least someone who's asking for it. Is that the way this legislation would work?
That is correct. There was a bill filed last session of the General Assembly that would mandate that DCS could not accept a child abuse report unless the person making the report gave their name and contact information. Okay. As you mentioned, we are in a mandated reporter state, so they have to report, but this would remove that option of making the report anonymously. Now, that bill was not passed during the last session. It was sent to a summer study session, and that's what happened this week as the committee that's been examining this sat down with and heard testimony from both sides about the importance of this bill and what it would do.
All right, and Stephen, if you would, just give me some of the numbers right now on how many calls, reports came into, I guess, the state DCS, and if there's a breakdown of how many of them were anonymous and how many of them maybe perhaps turned out to be false calls.
So, first of all, there's over 100,000 reports made last year of child abuse through the DCS hotline. Okay. And of those, only about 18% were filed anonymously. So more than 80% of the folks that made a report gave their name and contact information. So less than 1 in 5 were actually anonymous. Now, the process of whether false calls or not is complicated. Often you'll have a circumstance where there are multiple reports on the same child, and so they'll screen those out. And so if there's 3 or 4 different reports, a doctor and a teacher and a neighbor have all reported the same child, that will go in as 3 reports, but there's only 1 case that's taken forward. And so that isn't a false call, that's simply screened out. The process, and there's a much more involved process that I'll let Dawn talk about, where there's an investigation that goes into that report, and that report is either substantiated, which means that there's evidence meaning that there's likely happened abuse, or it's unsubstantiated. And that would be what we perceive as a false call, but it's not necessarily made maliciously. It's just there wasn't enough evidence to confirm it was abuse. The state's not going to move forward with a case if it is unsubstantiated.
Okay, and that makes sense. And they have to reach that substantiation. What do you think, Dawn, then? Is there a concern here about this bill that it would if it became law, chill folks into not reporting it? And is it that big an issue one way or the other when you consider that almost 80% already give their names as it is?
Sure, absolutely. Nashville Children's Alliance serves Davidson County, and in Davidson County, we receive about 1,400 to 1,600 cases of severe abuse each year. So if the 18% is the amount of calls that come in made by anonymous reporters, this could result in about 300 children that may or may not, their case may or may not be investigated. So absolutely, child abuse experts throughout Tennessee are concerned about this. I think that child abuse experts and task force and advocates for many years have done the very best job they can in advocating for children. And I do think it would take a couple step backwards if we went forward with this.
That it could chill. Now, just to see the other side of the coin and what the lawmakers or supporters of the bill say is that there are times when false claims are made. In fact, I'm not saying there's a lot, but it does happen. And I guess, is there already a law on the books? I mean, I'd like to think and hope if someone makes a false report on a child abuse case, which can tear apart a family, I mean, it's an awful thing to do, then they ought to be nailed by the law. The problem is if you don't know who they are, you can't catch them, right?
Correct. There actually is a felony already on the books in Tennessee code that makes it a Class C felony, I believe, to knowingly and maliciously make a false report of child abuse. And we've not been able to figure out how many times that's been prosecuted by DAs. I do know that DCS fairly commonly has their recording of the report subpoenaed, and they'll turn it over. You mentioned that it's difficult to identify that, but there's all kinds of reports that are made to the police department and the district attorney's offices that are difficult to identify. And nobody's going to prosecute any case without substantial evidence. So we're removing one piece if a DA decided to prosecute this, but we're not removing the case. I mean, for example, if it's a recording of the call, you're going to know if it's male or female. You're going to know where the call came from. You're going to have lots of evidence to start the investigation, even if you don't know exactly who made the call.
I see. I guess you make a good point there. If someone is choosing to, for whatever reason, make a false report and call that in and be anonymous, you know, you would think they're probably doing that on their own. And if there's an initial call, and I'm not sure DCS, how they handle this, maybe you two can speak to this. When they get a call like this, you know, if there's one, maybe another, I suppose someone who wants to do a false call could have a couple friends make false calls as well, perhaps. How do they vet it, you know, from that initial call in any case that comes in to try to make the determination whether or not it's real or not? And I know that's a hard thing to do. Look, I mean, it's a very difficult thing anyway, but how will they look at that?
Sure. So if a call comes in to the DCS hotline, the DCS hotline staff and leadership will evaluate that information and see if a DCS referral is warranted. And if a DCS referral is warranted, DCS will go out and investigate. They will go out and talk to folks and do their due diligence in investigating the potential allegation. And we have throughout the state, I'm very proud that we have a child protective investigative team that is mandated by law to work together. The CPIT, or Child Protective Investigative Team, consists of Department of Children's Services, the Child Advocacy Center in each jurisdiction, as well as local law enforcement, the DA's office, juvenile court, and the medical professionals that will, and everyone is skilled and trained to investigate. So if there are false allegations, it will likely be acknowledged and the case will be closed.
Yeah, and if you can, just before we go to the break, do you know, Dawn, what are the types of red flag things that they would hear when they're evaluating based on a call or two? What kind of things do they need to hear that maybe leads them to say, yeah, let's go ahead and open an investigation here?
I think if a caller is making any allegations of seeing, if it's a physical abuse case, seeing any marks on the body, or if they have, you know, any substantial information should warrant a DCS investigation. Like Stephen talked about earlier, if there's multiple calls on the same child, that too could be a red flag the other way. It could be a red flag the other way. Okay, so multiple folks are afraid that something is happening to this child. So I think that they do their due diligence. I think that they do a really good job in determining whether they need to open up an investigation or not.
Listen, we'll take a break on that. This is interesting. A lot more to talk about. We have some phone calls coming in as well as we're talking about reporting child abuse in the state. And we may go beyond even just what we're talking about here with regard to this legislation, just about what people need to know and how to handle it when they have suspicions, because I know both of you are experts in that field. We'll take a break and be back with more with our fine guests right after this.